Oh, goodness me. Welcome, everybody. Welcome. Just seeing the screens fill up here. How wonderful to welcome so many people this morning or this evening or whatever time of the day it is from whatever part of the world you are, to this session of introducing Willem Kuyken's new book, which I believe the publication date is today in the United States. Is that correct?
That's right.
I think we won't have it. We have to wait a little bit, but today is the official publication date. So you are the very, very first people to really hear about this publicly. And just while just to allow a moment or two for people to arrive, let's do a very, very short anchoring practice. So the invitation to simply, as you know, close the eyes or lower the gaze, whichever's best for you. And just spend a moment connecting with whatever it is in your senses that anchor you to the present moment, be that something from the outside, a sound, a touch, something from the inside of the body, sense of the breath, the feet on the floor. Just a few moments to gather and anchor the attention. And including in this a sense of welcome to yourself, however you're feeling at the moment, sleepy, agitated, happy, awake, whatever it happens to be. And also a sense of welcome to every one of us here, gathered together for this occasion. Just opening with friendliness to whatever is here. And perhaps also just an opportunity to contemplate the question, what would I most like to know about this new book? Because there will be an opportunity to ask later. What would I most like to know about it? And when you're ready, opening the eyes. So in a moment, I'll officially introduce Willem, but just to say that the shape of this session will be a dialogue. I'll ask Willem some questions, but mostly it will be him telling us the contents of the book. And then towards the end, there will be 20 minutes or so for your questions. So as many of you probably know, the way we do this, if you could please put your questions in the chat and just ask that you use the chat simply for questions that you'd like to ask Willem rather than a sort of off-piste conversation. And the team here will gather those questions and collect them together, and then we'll have an opportunity at the end to put them to Willem. Does that sound okay? Lovely. So, thank you, Professor Willem Kuyken, Ritblat Professor of Mindfulness and Psychological Science at Oxford University. Thank you for being here to introduce your book to us. And I'm not going to say a great deal about Willem because you all know who he is probably, so he doesn't need much of an introduction. But I am going to just briefly introduce the book. And this book is part of a trilogy. I think that's the first thing I want to say. The first part of the trilogy was this book, which you probably all know and have read, the book he wrote with Christina Feldman, which is a deeper dive into the psychological science, if you like, both from the Buddhist perspective and the Western cognitive science perspective, this deeper dive into how these two seamlessly weave together to support what we know as the modern mindfulness practice. So that was the first one. The third one is one which is still being written, where Willem is collaborating with Paul Bernard and Ruth Baer. And this will be a manual for teachers. This will be the equivalent of, just like the Green Book is for MBCT, this will be the teacher manual for MBC, for Mindfulness for Life. Willem, when are you expecting that to come out?
I'm hoping towards the end of next year.
End of next year. But in the middle, and excuse me, holding up a piece of paper, is this. This is the book that is now published together. Incredible image on the cover. Mindfulness for Life, which is intended as a book for the general readership, requiring no previous or specialist knowledge about mindfulness. So I think my first question to you, Willem, would be, there's already quite a lot of books for the general public on mindfulness. What inspired you to write this one, and why would anyone want to buy it? What's different or new about it, about this particular book?
First of all, Alison, thank you so much for agreeing to have this conversation with me about these ideas and about the new book, and incredibly grateful thanks to everybody who has shown up this morning to hear about these ideas and hear about the book. A very warm welcome to you all. So to respond to your question, Alison, I love the phrase, practice is life and life is practice. And the way I understand that is that when we practice mindfulness in whatever form, brief practices, longer practices, we meet ourselves and we meet our lives. And in every moment of our life, we have good, bad, challenging, joyful. We have an opportunity to bring awareness, to bring discernment, to bring wisdom to those moments. And so what the book is essentially doing is suggesting and providing a sort of curriculum, if you like, for people to really weave mindfulness into the fabric of their lives and for a lifetime. I think the second thing I would say is I have this sense that the word mindfulness is a word that has become quite mainstream, but nonetheless quite misunderstood. And I wanted to take what I see from ancient wisdom and from modern psychology as some of the kind of most robust ideas about what mindfulness is and importantly isn't, and communicate that in a really accessible and engaging way. So I've tried to write it, and the group of us who've been developing these ideas have tried to develop these ideas in a way that they can be accessible to everybody and engaging to everybody. And I think the final thing I would say is, and this is part of the debunking, is that people have sometimes said, isn't mindfulness quite a sort of selfish or an inner pursuit? And I think that's a really profound misunderstanding of what mindfulness is, because when we meet our body and our mind, we meet the world, we meet the imprint of the world on us. And when we are aware and guided by our values, we shape the world. So there is this sense of inner and outer, which is an integral part of the book as well.
So in what way do you think that that differs from previous books about mindfulness? What would you say were some of the key differences?
I think really trying to draw on the very best of modern psychology and the very best of ancient wisdom, Buddhist psychology. And the lineage that I'm drawing on is the sort of lineage developed by John Kabat-Zinn and Mark Williams and Zindel Segal and John Teasdale. One thing I would say, Alison, in response to what you're, to be slightly playful, is I don't want to argue that this is so very different. These ideas are ancient, and there has been extraordinary amounts of really high quality psychological science. And what I'm trying to do is to distill that in a way that people can use it to really build it into their life. So I don't want to stand here and say these ideas are novel and new. They're not. I'm standing on the shoulders of thousands of years of contemplative traditions, ideas that have been used in across the world by hundreds of millions of people, and honed to cultivate focus, to cultivate attitudes of mind, to develop insight, to develop wisdom, to develop discernment.
So one of the things you just said, Willem, excuse me, in what you explained there, was this idea of bringing the practice right into every moment of your everyday life.
Yeah.
And perhaps there is a misunderstanding or an understanding that mindfulness is something you do, you sit on a cushion or whatever, and it takes 30 or 40 minutes a day. But what you're emphasizing is that it's actually woven into the very fabric of every lived moment of an ordinary, extraordinary life. I wonder if you could say a bit more about that.
Yeah, so in the spirit of dialogue, the first thing I would say is, what you say about sitting on a cushion for 30 minutes, I think I'm probably the reality now is actually most people think it's listening to an app for 5 minutes. And if in terms of hundreds of millions of people being exposed to mindfulness, that's how they've been exposed to mindfulness. And the other thing many people here, I think, will resonate with is having a period of mindfulness practice that then drops off. And I so often meet people who say, yes, I tried mindfulness for a while. It was helpful, but I don't do that anymore. Or worse still, I tried mindfulness, it doesn't work for me. And to be a bit challenging, I would say that's a little bit like saying, I tried having friends for a while. It didn't work for me. Or I tried eating well for a while. It didn't work for me. Or I tried sleeping well for a while and it didn't work for me. What I mean by that is if we step back and think about mindfulness as being awareness imbued with kindness, curiosity, and care, which is aligned with our values, what does that mean to be, I tried being aware. I tried being kind to myself. I tried living in a way that was aligned with my values and it didn't work for me. That doesn't make any sense. What people are talking about is perhaps I tried an extended 40-minute mindfulness practice and that fell off over time. So what I'm trying to suggest is, can we change the frame and think about all of the different mindfulness practices, and there are hundreds, and the ways in which we can weave those into our lives so they become a part of everyday life. And that when we think about those practices, we don't go, oh gosh, I've forgotten to do that for a whole period of time. We go, there's my old friend. There's someone I actually like to have alongside me. And I think that's a very different relationship, both to mindfulness, but also to mindfulness practice.
Yeah, yeah. So in what you just said there, what I'm reminded of is in the introduction, right on page 2, I think, of your book, you mention 3 keys for a life well lived.
Yep.
And you just mentioned all of them. One of them is befriending your mind.
Mm-hmm.
Another is using your values as a compass.
Mm-hmm.
And another is the, being awake, being aware, living your life, knowing that you're living it. And I wonder if we could just, perhaps if there's time, just look at each of these a little more. So the first one that you have as an overarching thing throughout the whole book is the importance of your mind being your best friend. You've just said it's like your best friend. Could you say a little bit more about how you've brought that out in the book?
So I would like to invite everybody on the call right now to just consider someone in their life who they consider a really good friend, or it could even be a cat or a dog, or a sibling with whom you have a good relationship. What are the qualities of that relationship? And people will often say, and I hope this resonates with you as you think about this person, they will say, this is someone I trust. This is someone I like spending time with. This is someone I feel who has my back. This is someone I feel who is there for me through thick and thin. They know about some of my weaknesses. They know about some of the things in me that are less attractive, are difficult to be with, but they still stand by me nonetheless. We laugh together. I'm pleased to see them. I know that they have some things I find challenging, but I love them nonetheless. Now, think about those qualities you think of in your friend or your sibling or your pet, and think, is that the kind of relationship I have with my own mind? When I think about my own mind, do I think of it as somewhere I like to spend time? Do I have my own back? Do we laugh together? Do we have that kind of relationship? And by the way, my colleague and good friend, and Alison's also, Ruth Bayer, said something really interesting the other day, which I hadn't fully thought about. She said, friendships often have a life course, but our relationship with our mind doesn't have a life course beyond from the moment we're born to the moment we die. So it also has to evolve over time. And so what I'm suggesting is that the relationship we have with our mind is really important. And there are certain kind of attitudes that mindfulness practices for thousands of years have been really good at cultivating. These include curiosity, kindness, compassion, equanimity, courage, letting go, forgiveness, if you like. These are all practices that can cultivate a particular kind of relationship with our mind. And that whole family of practices, if you like, can be called befriending practices. But this relationship we have with our mind, I think, is so important. I think it is the stuff of mental health and well-being, but it is also the ground, the capacity from which we meet the world. If we meet the world with curiosity, we meet the world with an openness, a kind of approach orientation. And if you take the opposite of curiosity or antonyms, you have disengagement, you have skepticism. This is a way of turning away from the world. So this whole family of attitudes of mind that I put into this category of befriending the mind is an absolutely fundamental key of mindfulness. And once we do that, mindfulness practice, to go back to your earlier point, Alison, becomes something that we want to do. It's a relationship we want to cultivate. The final thing I'd say about this, so one of the other things I'll just say about the book is, yes, it's supposed to be accessible. Yes, it's supposed to be engaging, but every chapter starts, and I can see Claire Kelly on the call here, and she and I used to talk about how does one introduce mindfulness to people skillfully, And she had this wonderful idea of, it's a bit like somebody who is perhaps learning to swim in the sea, and you first bring them to the car park by the sea, and they look over the dunes and they go, oh, it looks rather big and the waves are rather scary. And you kind of just sit on the beach, and then you maybe just paddle in the edges, and then after a while you go in, and after a while you might want to actually really swim in the sea. So each of the chapters is doing that. It's sort of bringing people to the car park, and then it's going deeper and deeper and deeper. By the way, Alison, you know me well, so if at some point you think I'm starting to become a bit tiresome, please tell me to stop, and we'll move to the next subject. But this idea of befriending the mind, I've just introduced it, but you can do this at deeper and deeper and deeper and deeper levels. So, for example, if you think about the different attitudes of mind, you can think of it a bit like a mixing board that, like sound engineers use. And you go, this particular moment in my life, this particular relationship, or this particular moment in relationship, what does it need? And you can dial up kindness, dial down curiosity, you can dial up equanimity, you can dial up courage. And so I remember a time in my life where I felt I needed an awful lot of kindness, an awful lot of courage, and an awful lot of letting go. So for a period of months, I dialed those three attitudes up in my practice in the morning, so that when I moved into the day, I had a sense of being able to move into the day with a sense of interest, kindness, courage, and letting go. So there's a mixing board that we can, over time, go, okay, this is what's needed at this moment in time. And then the final thing I'd say is the point that Ruth made: different points in our life require more things. I'm getting a little bit older, and those on the call who are maybe a little bit older, different parts of our bodies aren't the way they used to be. This requires letting go, letting an acceptance and a friendliness towards parts of our body that are changing or shifting. So that's the first key, Alison. And the reason I've in a way spoken a bit longer is to make the point that within every chapter, there is, as Claire put it, a sort of introduction to the idea, but there is later in the chapter, this is what sea swimming in winter looks like.
Yeah. So I'm really pleased that you've mentioned the structure of each chapter, because I think it's so important the way you do it there, an introduction leading to a much deeper immersion, if you like. And I think also, just in a little while, I think it'd be really helpful to show people the structure of the book itself, the chapters, and how they, that's okay. But just before that, coming back to some of the things you said earlier and your key points, some of the things that you've really worked to bring out in this book. And you mentioned this fact that sometimes, mindfulness has been taken to be a little bit inward looking, a little bit selfish. However, your mind is what you meet the world with. And so these values are both inward in terms of your own mind, and hence outward in terms of how that can transform your relationships to others, to the world, to the wider ecosystem, and so on, and how important it is that your values can guide you in that. And I think this is really interesting. Could you say a little bit more about how you've brought that out in the book? This relationship of inner and outer, and the importance of values as giving you a sense of direction.
I'm happy to do that. Alison, in a spirit of dialogue, because you have taught this curriculum and you have trained so many people to teach this curriculum, what is your experience of how participants respond to this invitation to befriend their minds through the appreciation practices, through the befriending practices, and so on? What's your experience of how people engage with this element of the course or the curriculum, if you like?
Okay, so when we teach the course, of course, the appreciation practice comes up right at the beginning. And I would say in just about every course I've taught, and I'm sure there are many teachers here who find the same, that is probably one of the most transformative practices. It is one that people can weave into their everyday life. They start to feel the benefit of it immediately. And this brings in this whole sense of how waking up, those positive attitudes of mind, transforms not only your relationship with the world and your sense of awe and wonder, but actually your well-being. I think that the befriending, really learning to befriend your own mind, is a slower process.
Mm-hmm.
It's one which people always comment on, the change, learning to be kinder to themselves. It's always one of the ones they take as the key learning points from a course, and they realize that it's a progression.
Mm-hmm.
It's something that the value of it is immediately recognized, but it's not always so easy. So it's something that is both transformative and really, when you're working with quite embedded attitudes of criticism and blame and so on,
Yeah,
people realize how profoundly important this kindness to self is.
yeah,
Also, that it's something they really need to practice.
yeah, yeah.
Does that answer your question?
Yeah, thank you. And just to build a little bit on what you said, and then I'll come to your question about values, is if what I'm trying to suggest is we want to find a way of making these rich practices, this way of living, accessible to people. People have to be engaged. They have to feel like this is something that they want to do, that enriches their life. And I think what you've described there, and that's the reason we place the appreciation practice right at the beginning of the curriculum, is people go, gosh, okay, this isn't something that I felt like is a good thing to do, like going to the gym to build up my kind of my strength or my core. In a sense, of course, it is that, but this is also something that in my lived experience right here, right now, is enriching my life. And so I want to do more of it. So to come to the piece about values, I think one of the misunderstandings about mindfulness is people say, well, if it's taught in a kind of secular setting, you're taking it out of its ethical framework. Whether that's from professional ethical frameworks or Buddhist or religious ethical frameworks. And I think that, again, is a misunderstanding, and I want to debunk that. And what we're trying to do, what I'm trying to do in the book, and what we're trying, those of us who've been heavily involved in teaching and developing these ideas, is to find a way of helping people to become kind of. So one of the metaphors I use throughout the book is of a tree. And we're learning through science a lot more about the natural world. And the natural world is so rich with learning for how we live our lives, right? And so with the tree metaphor, what I'm thinking of is the roots as being like our values. Our ethical basis, and that we can draw up from our roots the nutrients from the earth. And some of them are our own very individual values, but some of them are also values we've learned from our family, or might be part of our religious community, or they are, one might argue, more universal values, things that most people would agree these are kind of values to live by. So if you bring awareness and you start to be a bit more kind of kind and friendly towards your own mind and body, what do you do with that? Without values, without a sense of a compass or direction, it's just awareness. The compass gives it direction. It gives it a sort of a motivational force and a place to move towards. And I started the first 25 years of my career working with depression, a really huge global health crisis, and also something I know personally. And so in that work of mindfulness-based cognitive therapy for depression, one of the key parts of the compass is to help people to be free from depression and to live well. In the Mindfulness for Life work, where we're bringing things more into the mainstream for the population as a whole, we invite people to think, what are the values that are important to you? And this will be different for everybody. I just had a friend and a colleague who passed away recently, and we had some exchanges on voice memos and in the weeks leading up to the end of her life, and she was reflecting on this question. And of course, it wasn't an abstract question, it was a very real question. She was weeks away from the end of her life, and she talked about presence in my loving relationships, past and present. That was it. She didn't say anything about the amount of money in the bank. She didn't say anything about her CV. She didn't say anything about, maybe some of those other things were important to her, but that's what in her value base at that point was really important. And we developed this over the course of, again, we could take this to use Claire's analogy of the parking lot by the beach right the way through to the sea. You can sort of begin to flirt with ideas of values. And then you can go much deeper and deeper and deeper. And really at different transition points in our lives, those values again are going to shift. As people think about entering a relationship, consider having children or not having children, consider what kind of work they want to do. These are bigger moments to really reflect on one's values.
And do you specifically mention that in the book, how this relates to transition times in a normal human life?
Absolutely. One of the things, yeah, the transition point is a big part of the book. But one of the things that I think is really helpful, and Alison, this may have been an insight I had from one of the participants in one of your classes. People said, somebody was describing how between stimulus and response, there is a space. And I guess that's one of the things we're trying to do with mindfulness, right? Is we're trying to help people to have a sense of a bit more spaciousness. Things are happening, things are coming in, my senses are awake. And then what do I do with that? What do I say? What do I do? What do I not say? What do I not do? What do we do in that space? And what she said was, that's where my values come in. They help me to know what to say, what not to say, what to do, what not to do. And I think that can become, it can be quite implicit, but we can also make it quite explicit. We can say, I've got a really tricky conversation coming up today on our meditation cushion in the morning, or to make it more every day on my tube ride into work, or on my walk into work. And what will serve me? What will serve this other person? What will be right for the well-being of me and this other person? And then Alison and I have played with this question, which I love. It comes from Oliver Berkman, which is, what will enlarge me? What will enlarge me? What will enlarge the other person? And what will enlarge the world? And there's something about that spaciousness and enlargement into which values can flow. And I think, I don't want to be political in any sense, but I think there is a real need and a space for values to have more of a place in the world just now. And they can help us make wise choices, small and large.
Willem, thank you so much. My eyes are on the time, knowing we want to leave 20 minutes for questions from people present. And there's so much more I'd like to ask you. But if I could just take one of the things that, again, is quite a new chapter in your book. And that is, we're very used to mindfulness being about the what, what are we paying attention to, how, the kindness, the care, and so on. But you've also given great importance to the view, the perspective, the lens that we look through. And the book has a chapter and some exercises on what perspective are you taking? What perspective does the person you're talking to hold, and so on. I wonder if you could say a little bit more about why you wanted to give so much attention to us having the opportunity to look at the perspective, the lens through which we're looking, and is it possible to see through a different coloured lens? Could you say a little, well, 3 minutes?
Of course. So in March 1968, just a few months before I was born, the Vietnam War was in full flow, and the Americans were kind of on their knees, and things were not going as they wanted. And there was a military exercise into a village in Vietnam called My Lai. And the American soldiers that went into the village were battle weary, cynical, young, very young people, in their 18, 19, early 20s. And they were expecting to go into this village and meet Viet Cong fighters. And it turns out there were no Viet Cong fighters there. There were just women, children, and elderly people. But often they were, Viet Cong fighters were not. I'm not making any kind of judgments, political judgments at all here. But one of the lieutenants, a young man, decided to start massacring the villagers. And because he was in command, he made others start massacring the villagers. And many dozens of people were massacred. And what was really interesting in that moment is that there was a helicopter flying above the scene with 3 equally young men in the helicopter, one of whom was Native American. And they were there to provide support to the soldiers. So if they saw Viet Cong fighters, they would report where they were and they would protect the soldiers. And the young captain, I think he was in his early 20s, of the helicopter, was looking down. He goes, there's gunfire and there's people being shot, but I cannot see any Viet Cong fighters. What's happening? This is very anxiety provoking. And then in that moment, he went, oh my goodness, there are no Viet Cong fighters. The soldiers on my side are shooting women, children, and the elderly on the other side. And in that moment, he shifted perspective and he went, oh, my army are the perpetrators here. And he landed the helicopter between the American soldiers and the villagers, and he turned the turrets on his own soldiers. And he said, stop firing or I will open fire on you. Now, why am I telling that story? Is in the midst of a really difficult situation, this young guy, a lot of adrenaline, everything else flowing out, was able to completely shift perspective. And that shift in perspective enabled him to completely change his action. The shift in perspective changed in-group, out-group, us, them, and it led, perhaps because of his background, being Native American, being used to being on the outside, I don't know, it's been speculated, enabled him to take action, which was tremendously courageous. And by the way, it'd be nice if this was a Hollywood movie with a happy ending. The army did not thank him for this. His colleagues did not thank him for this, and the rest of his life was not one of a hero. And think about some of the things that are happening in the world today. Our ability to shift perspective, to think about who's the in-group, who's the out-group, to think in non-polarized ways is something that is much needed in the world. So, Alison, I'm partly triggered by you saying we're towards the end of the time that we've got. So what I'm wanting to say is that this work is about inner and outer, and this is a really good example of outer. This ability to shift perspective can be about social change, it can be about the climate, it can be about polarization, it can be about all sorts of things. Now that's quite a dramatic example. In the chapter, much more, back to Claire Kelly's car park point, it introduces the idea in a much kind of softer way and starts with really, really small things. We can get caught up as we try to go to sleep with all of the worries from the day. Just grounding ourselves in our body is a shift in perspective. We're shifting perspective from thinking, worry, rumination to experiencing our body as it is in this moment. Other ways of shifting perspective involve the friend idea. How would my best friend see this particular scenario, particular situation? Another way of shifting perspective is to play with time zones. I love the idea of a worry jar. We do this with children. What are you worried about? Oh, I'm really worried about Susie at school. She, I don't know if she's going to invite me to a party on Saturday. Okay, let's write that down and put it in the worry jar. Then you open it on Sunday and they go, and you go, oh, was I really worried about that? Of course she was going to invite me, and we had a lovely time. So that's a shift in perspective over time, and we can play with that in a big way, right? We can play with that in terms of 5 years hence. How will I look back on this? So mindfulness enables us to ground and have awareness, and then begin to play with these different shifts in perspective, so that when it comes to bigger things, we can go, oh, what's happening here? And can I shift as that young soldier did in the helicopter? And that, I think, again, to make a point I made earlier, is something the world really needs right now, the ability to do that. Alison, I don't know if you recall, but during the pandemic, was it during the pandemic? I can't remember it was. It was with the American elections. And it was the day after, I think Donald Trump lost the election. Again, I'm not being political, but we had one of these Zoom online calls, and it was just very much in everybody's mind. And I thought it would be disingenuous not to work with that. So we worked with it. And what I invited people to do was to try to shift perspective. 79 million people thought and felt this. 79 million, give or take a couple of 100,000, thought this. Can we play with what it's like to stand in that person's shoes, to stand in that person's shoes? So I just think this is something that's really needed at that level, but also at the level of families, at the level of our own inner experience as well.
Yeah. So starting with trying to understand and give value to another person's point of view can be the way, in smaller things, the way in which we can perhaps develop the capacity to take a different view in the really critical moments of life. Yes. Willem, I think there are some questions. There's a couple of other things very quickly. This book has been quite a long time in the making, hasn't it? You'd started writing it before COVID. What's the most important or surprising thing that you came across when you were thinking about researching and writing this book?
Well, first of all, the book has been gestating in my mind for as long as I can remember, or the ideas have, and all of the people I've interacted with as teachers, as trainers, as students, as colleagues, as friends have in some way shaped the ideas in here. I think it's sometimes said that if you want to write a good book, you first have to live that book. And I think that's probably what surprised me the most is that I really, in the process of writing, have really tried as best I can to live the ideas, but not just live them, just me personally, but live them in my relationships too. So I think I've played with these ideas. I've talked to people about these ideas. Many of these ideas have come from other people. And that's not because I'm a magpie taking people's ideas. It's because these ideas are age old and deep in our culture and in our history. And so I think when I talk to others, they too live these ideas, different ideas at different times in their lives. And I think that's the most surprising, that it can resonate with the most surprising people in the most surprising ways. But yes, I've lived this as I was writing it, and as I was writing it, I've lived it. And just to come full circle, it's like life is practice and practice is life.
So thank you, Willem. And actually just seeing some of the questions coming up in the chat, one of them is from a teacher who's saying, trained to teach mindfulness for life a while ago, is this going to change the way the course is taught? I think that's something that we can address. But I wonder if Ellie, you're our Zoom driver, just for a moment, could you put up the screen with what the actual chapters in the book are? And then just for a few moments, is that possible, Ellie? So people can actually see the structure of how the book has evolved. It might be possible.
Whilst Ellie's doing that, just to respond to the question of whether it will change the program that you perhaps are teaching, for those of you who've taken the program or are teaching the Mindfulness for Life 8-week program, I think that program is a great program. It's building on the DNA of MBCT and MBSR, and it's got some of the sort of best of psychological ideas in it. And so I think it's probably fair to say that it's a gentle evolution of that program. And there are some things that maybe are emphasized a bit more and a few things that are emphasized less based on our experience of what really works. So to answer your question, not a lot, maybe a gentle evolution. But I think what I would say is what we're trying to do is to place the curriculum in a bigger picture. That program is quite a deep dive. And how do you introduce people to these ideas? So Alison and I and others have developed a way of introducing mindfulness that has the essence of mindfulness-based cognitive therapy in it, in a very simple way of introducing it. The book is also a way of introducing it even before that. And there is a website that is associated with the book, which I think will be sent around as well, where a really good filmmaker has worked with me, Tyson Joseph, and he's created a set of 12 30-second films that introduce the ideas in 30 seconds to the kind of audience we might not be used to speaking to. And then beyond the 8-week course, we've developed a Taking It Further curriculum, where we try to take people further and deeper with the ideas. And the first randomized controlled trial of that curriculum, and those of you who know me well will know I'm not one to overstate the evidence of anything. I'm usually understate the evidence. But that trial, 12 Oxford Mindfulness Foundation teachers taught that curriculum, some of whom are on the call today. When I first saw the findings, I thought this can't be right. They're too good to be believed. We had medium to large effect sizes on well-being, and we actually were moving people from well-being to thriving. So there's this sort of global health argument of, can we, to take again Claire's idea, can we first introduce people to these ideas with the book and with these introductory modules? Can we then take them on a deeper dive, which is the 8-week course? And for those who then want to, can we take them to a place of thriving? And it looks like we can. I mean, we need all of you who are engaged with these items, but it looks like we can. And the book is designed as intended to be a sort of bedrock that sits behind all of that people who are first being introduced to it and going on that journey can use to go deeper and deeper and wider and wider.
Brilliant. So, Willem, there have been a number of questions, but some of them around similar themes. Just to show people, if you can all see this, can you see now this image of the chapters? Everybody see that? Yeah. So just a moment for you to see how the book is structured. And I think that's quite helpful in the context of everything that Willem's saying, how this, the skills evolve throughout the book to a chapter of a life well lived. I'm going to stop the share now because hopefully you're all going to buy the book and be able to see it for yourselves. But Willem, there's quite a lot of questions about befriending the mind. And one of them kind of captures, I think, quite a lot of the others. And the question is, if I can read it out. The question is, how do you befriend a mind that is stubbornly critical to the point where the mind meets anything kind with cynicism? So how do you befriend a mind that is stubbornly critical? And also there's a further thing of that. Is there a way of befriending the mind that can actually help with or improve cognitive impairment in conditions such as long COVID, menopause, dementia, etc.? There we're getting into transitions. But a number of questions about befriending the mind. How can we do it, and does it help us work with some of these conditions that actually affect our mental functioning?
So Alison spoke earlier about befriending the mind particularly for people who have got quite unfriendly relationships with their mind, is really a lifelong journey. It's not something that happens overnight. And I think if somebody has, to use this this question as a kind of premise, a very skeptical and self-critical and other critical frame of mind, that can be quite impenetrable. And it's also one of the well-known hindrances in mindfulness practice. It was observed by the Buddha 2,500 plus years ago. He called it doubt. He developed a whole set of practices for working with doubt. And I think, so what we know is that this is a mind state that's familiar ground. It's not easy to work with. It takes time, but you can break it down. And if you're patient over a period of time, you can begin to soften it. You can begin to open it. You can begin to examine and explore it. And by examine, I don't mean forensic. I mean with friendliness, with interest, with care. I have to say my reaction as a teacher to that question is a real sense. And I think this is about the journey and the embodiment. I just want to embrace that mind. I don't mean literally, because the person might say, what are you doing? Stupid, get away. You don't understand at all. But partly because that's my own journey. I think when I was a young man, my mind was so probably quite aversive. I just would be so busy with partying and drinking and being busy that I didn't even want to look at my mind. And when I did look at it, there was all sorts of self-criticism and striving. And now my relationship with my mind is much, much friendlier. Doesn't mean that doesn't still come up, but I can meet it in a different way. So the book has within it sections on how to work with these kinds of mind states. And we absolutely can work with them. The other question is about dementia and these other kinds of mindset. I want to say something which in a way comes out of our recent work in schools, is that I think there is also something really important about context and about the mindfulness in organizations, care homes, workplaces, and so on. So with somebody with advanced dementia, probably the most important thing to do is to provide a safe and friendly, in the befriending the mind kind of sense, context for that person to live in. And for the people who are the carers, professional and family and friends, to be resourced with mindfulness, to be able to meet the very many challenges of dementia, particularly when it goes on for a long period of time. And the book speaks quite explicitly about that at various places, but I think that is also true in schools. Can a school be a place that is imbued with awareness, with friendliness, with a clear ethical code, where, for example, everyone understands that bullying isn't tolerated, that kindness is valued, that learning is playful? This is about an outside-in form of mindfulness. And of course, that will also work with skepticism. That actually, when a skeptical person, if you think about the origins of skepticism, it may come from a place of fear or judgmentalism. The final thing I'd say about this, which I think is really interesting, is when people have enough space to look at some of these mind states, they can ask themselves, what sits beneath this? What sits below this? And if you bring an ethical compass to that, that can be really interesting. I discovered my inner critic deep, 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 deep down in the roots of the inner critic was something very wholesome. I wanted to do good work. I wanted to make a positive impact. And that then became manifest in an unhelpful way as an inner critic and a striving. But the roots weren't sick. The roots were healthy. So can you connect with the healthy part of the roots and then open the channels up, to go back to the tree metaphor, into the trunk of the tree so they don't become blocked by skepticism in this particular example? Alison, any thoughts that you would have about that question? Because you've worked, this is a very common thing that we work with in in Mindfulness for Life and other MBCT programs.
Actually, Willem, there's so many questions coming in on the chat from participants, and a couple of them, if you don't mind, one of them is actually picking up on this tree metaphor, and I'm going to read it because I think you'll like it. Okay. So, using Willem's tree metaphor, what is the potential through mindfulness practice for us to see that we are all connected via the earth, just as trees are through their roots, to each other and the natural world? In this way, maybe we can see and feel our common humanity, and through our practice help to dissolve the polarities which are limiting and threatening humanity, a potentially liberating shift in perspective. That's kind of a question that's addressed so much of what you've said, and relates also to other questions which are to do with how do you deeply embody this? And a tree rooted to the earth is the very paragon of embodiment, isn't it? So would you like to say anything about that?
I'd like to say 3 words to the questioner. Yes, yes, yes. And then I'd like to say to everybody else, this is the whole ethos of the book is, can we sort of awaken that sense of playfulness and curiosity? Because you can play with that idea, right? You can play with it just on your meditation cushion in the morning, just bringing to mind the sense of the tree in your practice. And then a sense of all the other people that you'll meet that day who are also perhaps trees as part of that kind of ecosystem. You can go hiking and move away from the idea of metaphor to actual reality. I know, I hope you won't mind me sharing, but Alison and Peter, her husband, recently moved away from a place called Puckham Barn in the Cotswolds back into a town house in Oxford. And about 2 or 3 years ago, they planted hundreds and hundreds of trees on their land as a part of the supporting the ecosystem of Puckham Barn, knowing full well they'd never see those trees grow, that they were planning to move before they grew into a forest. But there was a relationship with the land, and there was a relationship with the trees, and there was a relationship with a sense of ethics and compassion. Sorry, ethics and intentionality about the planting of those trees. And there's a joy that can be taken from that, and the generosity in that. I think one of the things, Alison, just to riff off that a tiny bit, is around the befriending the mind. It isn't just all an inner work, it's also an outer work. So in the sort of sense of appreciative joy that Christina and I talk about in our book, and I explore a bit more in this book as well, selfless generosity is a really key part of this work. It's how we can befriend our own minds and befriend the world. And I think, yes, 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 to playing with metaphors and ideas like that. So it becomes fun, it becomes interesting. It's something you want to do. Alison, I hope you didn't mind me sharing that about the tree.
No, not at all. Thank you. I'm aware that our time is up, Willem, and before I just say thank you, there is a question: will your book be published in other countries soon?
Yes, you can pre-order it now on pretty well every book site that I'm aware of. And just to say, it's coming out as a paperback, and I've tried to make sure it's priced so it's not too unaffordable. But it's also coming out as a Kindle, and it's also coming out as an audiobook. The audiobook's not yet on the websites because they've just finished the production work on it, but hopefully that will be available too. If you don't mind me just saying, because I'm excited about it, there are 2 other features of the book which the audiobook really majors on, which is throughout the book we've got these 2 kind of characters, one of whom is an ancient oak. And the ancient oak is a character who acts as a narrator, talking about sort of the contemplative traditions and ancient wisdom. And then there is a barefoot professor who talks more about the psychological science. And there are also 4 case studies that are developed throughout the school, and there is quite a bit in there about dementia and about chronic ill health. The reason I mention it at this point, because I've just been reminded that the audiobook has actors. playing those parts, and it works really well. So it makes it a little bit like a play. And that, I think, is about trying to make these ideas engaging, right? Make these ideas really real and engaging and fun.
So thank you so much, Willem. Just to say to people in the chat is the link to Willem is doing 12 evening sessions, the third Tuesday of every month, starting this month, on each of them taking a chapter of the book. So you please do sign up for those. I think they'll be absolutely great. And Willem, thank you so much. You're probably not looking at the chat, but the thanks to you for your book and for this brilliant introduction to it are just sort of pouring in on the chat too fast for me to read. So thank you very, very much. Thank you.
So Alison, if I could just finish by saying something quickly. First of all, there's too many people to thank now. The acknowledgement section in the book is about 3 pages long. So I want to say thanks to all the people who contributed to the book, and to you, Alison, for comparing today. But actually also to everybody who's joined, because I think these ideas will only come to life through all of our collective lived experience, not just our experience, but all of the people that we interact with in our lives. So a huge bow of thanks to everybody who's joined for the call today.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you very much. And thank you, Willem.